In a bit more than a year and 4 months, they have already begun an aggressive and near-successful campaign to dismantle and dissolve the civil rights protections written into statute and case law in the last 25 years. The record is more than clear. In just the first 6 months of the Reagan administration, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice filed 5 civil lawsuits on discrimination issues, as against 17 such suits in the first 6 months of the Carter administration, and an incredible 24 in Richard Nixon's first half year in office. Under President Reagan in the first half of 1981, there were 8 objections filed under the Voting Rights Act, as against 23 under the previous administration. Now the President has endorsed what amounts to a backdoor repeal of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But their endorsement of weakening provisions of this act is a measure of the administration's intent toward black America. They intend, if we let them, to dilute the precious right to vote. They intend, in fact, to turn back the civil rights clock until it becomes a sundial. Attorney General William French Smith has resolved, even over the objections of the FBI, to roll back the reforms that protect us from illicit government surveillance. He wants to eliminate the independent special prosecutor, to legitimize corporate bribery overseas, to permit surprise searches of newsrooms, to restrict public inspection of public information. For the first time since Richard Nixon was president, the actions of the Department of Justice are subject to the review and approval of the White House and to political intervention from powerful Republican politicians. For example, the White House inserted itself into school desegregation litigation in Louisiana and in Missouri, the latter action at the urging of that state's Republican governor, Christopher Bond, no relation that we know. The Department of Justice, at the request of Senator Jeremiah Denton, removed the words white supremacy from a lawsuit against white supremacy in Mobile, Alabama. After House Republican Whip Trent Lott of Mississippi objected to a lawsuit against jail conditions in his state, the Attorney General announced that no longer would justice bring such suits. In school integration cases in Seattle and in Chicago, the Department of Justice shifted sides. In both cases, the Reagan Justice Department reversed the position taken by its predecessors in 3 administrations and supported school plans that would reinforce segregated schools. With increasing frequency, the Attorney General has attacked the federal courts for protecting the rights of minorities. The Assistant Attorney General has declared that the Weber case, endorsing voluntary affirmative action, was wrongly decided. In further repudiation of Brown, the Attorney General has said that children who do not want to attend integrated schools will not be required to do so. 24 hours before a voting discrimination case involving Senator Strom Thurmond's hometown was to be heard, the Justice Department switched sides, abandoning its support of black plaintiffs who charged intentional political discrimination. In civil rights generally, a retreat has been sounded, the government's forces leading the way toward the dismal, distant past. It is here their actions are most frightful, their purposes most sinister, their design a deliberate attempt to restore white skin privilege and white male dominance in American employment. The new chief of the Civil Rights Division of Justice has announced that no longer will the government require a discriminatory employer to promise to do wrong no more. Vice President Bush has just concluded a review of the guidelines designed to protect women from sexual harassment on the job and discrimination in college athletics. The Secretary of Labor has proposed new rules which will exempt 75% of the labor force from important civil rights protections. He's ordered rescinding a Carter-era prohibition against federal contractors purchasing memberships in discriminatory private clubs for their employees. Under immense pressure from the corporate community, the administration hopes to let the market system regulate full and fair employment for minorities and for women. The last time the market system guaranteed full employment for American black people was over 100 years ago. It was called slavery then. For these people, equal opportunity means a better than even chance for minorities and women to be out of work. It means an unequal chance at the welfare rolls, a head start in hopelessness, an affirmation of the opportunity America has always guaranteed blacks to be last hired and first fired. In a speech in late May, the Attorney General came dangerously close to saying that the government's lawyers would no longer obey the nation's law. Moreover, he revealed that he did not know or care much about case law in civil rights. He apparently believes that court cases can be overturned at the polls, that President Reagan was elected to overturn Supreme Court decisions his supporters do not like. Such ignorance is dangerous in a private practitioner. In the nation's top lawyer, it is an invitation to anarchy and an appeal to the racist instincts he is pledged by solemn oath to oppose. But this assault on our civil rights is only part of the picture. It is coupled with an all-out aggressive attack on the yet unfulfilled right of every American to be free from want and economic worry. Millions and millions of American families, both poor and working poor, are being daily herded further and further into poverty as they slip through a safety net so fragile and porous it would not contain Moby Dick. A study conducted by a former official of the Nixon administration for the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Welfare Policy concluded, the effect of the Reagan proposals will be to drive many low-income families deeper into poverty, while inflation continues to deplete the value of their diminishing income, and to shift significant fiscal, administrative, and political burdens onto states and localities whose budgets are already in the red. In fact, many working poor families suffer not one but several cuts. A CETA worker loses his or her job only to confront the consequences of other cuts in unemployment insurance, food stamps, Medicaid. A low-income worker is knocked off AFDC, loses Medicaid for her family as a result, faces cuts in subsidized housing, child care, energy assistance as well. One of these cuts poses a serious problem for a family. A chain of reduced assistance will be devastating. The fact that 1/3 of all the families in the United States will be harmed in some fashion, major or minor, by these cuts is a clear reminder of the necessity for a continuing struggle to end economic discrimination in America. The fact that disproportionate numbers of these families are black or brown is an unnecessary reminder that white supremacy remains an essential feature of the culture of mainstream America and may be permanently rooted in the American character. The president's budget policies in sum are anti-family and anti-black. But as the destruction of the social safety net moves forward, as the human infrastructure of the United States begins to collapse under a deliberate design of calculated neglect, the greedy appetite of the military machine grows more voracious every day. The administration is beating our plowshares into swords, our pruning hooks into spears. The choice they put before us in 1982 is greater than guns versus butter. It is soup kitchens and surplus cheese versus expensive airplanes and malfunctioning tanks. The $15.5 million it cost to build one Navy F-14 would build 1,000 two-bedroom homes. The $4.5 million it would have cost to create 860 miles of tunnel for the MX missile will pay the nation's mass transit bill for 1 year. The $60 million it takes to build one C-5A airplane would feed 12,000 four-person families for 1 year. And contrary to the administration's rhetoric, this kind of spending creates fewer, not more jobs for American workers. It is capital, not labor-intensive. For every $1 billion spent on the MX missile, 17,000 people would find work. But that same $1 billion in the civilian economy would employ 48,000 hospital workers, or 65,000 people in the building trades. It would pay for 72,000 school teachers, or police officers, or firefighters. It is obviously wasteful spending, too. In 1980, the Army's Patriot missile exceeded its cost over the rate of inflation by 53%. That was the equivalent of $285 million, dollar for dollar precisely the amount cut from the Women's, Infants, and Children's program. The result? 70,000 fewer pregnant women and fewer children will be assured of proper nutrition. The M1 tanks cost overrun in 1980, again above the rate of inflation, was $747 million. That's equal to the amount cut by Congress and the President from the Energy Conservation Program. The F-18 fighter plane cost overruns were $607 million, equal to the cuts made in aid to families with dependent children. The 43% increase in the cost of this airplane equals evaporated assistance to 400,000 American families. But even without these comparisons to much-needed spending for human needs, the wasteful nature of this kind of spending borders on the criminal. 6 years ago, General Dynamics proposed building a new shoulder-fired attack rocket launcher for the Army. The cost of these little items, $78 each. Today, they cost $1,000 each. 2 years ago, the Patriot Air Defense System would have cost $5.5 billion. Today, the cost is $7.8 billion for fiscal '82. The cost of one Apache helicopter has risen $6 million each in the last 2 years. Since last June, the price for Pershing missiles has doubled. 2 years ago, 1,110,000 Copperhead artillery shells cost $1.2 billion. Today, half as many cost exactly the same amount. But you know the kind of aggressive militarism we face in '81 and '82. The callous cutbacks in human programs is not the first time in American history political capital has been earned at the expense of the people living on the economic edge. What is happening to black and poor America in 1982 has sadly happened more than once before. As in the Reconstruction period, 100 and more years ago, the collusion between a hostile administration and a seemingly unfeeling majority seemed to doom the hopes of the American underclass. Then and now, a president desperate for power entered into an illicit arrangement, not just with the unreconstructed South, but with the national unreconstructed mentality that believed then, as it does now, that private profit and public arrogance could be pursued at the expense of the people living on the American margin. As in that earlier period, it is true today, the aspirations of and movement by black people began to be curtailed, not just by organized violence and barbarity, but by a series of nationally choreographed legal and extra-legal maneuvers designed to make us less than political and economic equals. In our immediate past, the frenetic activity of the early 1960s had by the 1970s created a political counter-revolution characterized by selfishness and fear. A constituency of the comfortable, the callous, and the smug was recruited to form solid ranks against the forgotten. This massive manipulation of the American mind has made the mundane magnificent and put government in the hands of men who believe in privilege for the powerful and neglect of the powerless. Over the same 2-decade span, a great deal else has changed too. The American economy has changed considerably. The new economists brought to power in the early 1960s by John F. Kennedy believed that judicious manipulation of fiscal and monetary policy would automatically dissolve racism, poverty, and want. But these planners either did not or could not or would not foresee the increased corporate control of the American economy. By 1978, the top 100 U.S. companies controlled more of our total assets than the top 200 did in 1948. American capital has begun to control rather than obey the laws of supply and demand. In the 30s, for example, When 1/4 of the labor force was idle in the streets, business lowered its prices to maintain volume at a time of falling consumption. In the late 1970s, on the other hand, corporations raised prices when demand dropped in order to maintain high profits. Next, the world outside our borders has changed radically. First, the United States began to lose what it had never owned. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Cuba, and Iran. Despite our excessive ability to fire missiles and drop bombs, we lost because we aligned ourselves with the forces of reaction and colonialism, and because we opposed mass movements armed with a popular political appeal bound to defeat a superior military machine. In Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, the United States lost again, as the regimes we supported were overthrown. In El Salvador, Nicaragua, Namibia, we are sure to lose, as we continue to mislearn the lessons of our own imperial past. About a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, on October 28, 1980, candidate Reagan asked the voters to ask themselves if they were better off than they had been 4 years earlier when Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. After nearly a year and a half of the Reagan presidency, that question ought be asked again. For some Americans, the answer is a not unsurprising yes. If anyone here, for example, earns more than $100,000 a year, the answer must be yes. You're going to bring home an extra $2,000 from the Reagan tax plan, and even at $100,000 a year, an extra $2 surely can't hurt. If you own an oil company, the answer must be yes. You're so busy counting your windfall profits you don't have time to look for oil, so you just buy up smaller oil companies instead. If you dump poisonous waste in a river or a lake, it's smooth sailing ahead. The EPA has cut back its enforcement forces. If you manufacture products that could be dangerous to the public, you're in good shape. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has dropped investigations into products linked to 60,000 injuries and 500 deaths each year. If you own a factory that's dangerous to your employees, you're home free. OSHA inspections are down 17% so far in '82. If you expect to inherit a large estate, you've got to say yes. Estate taxes have almost been repealed. If you own a pharmaceutical firm, you've got to say yes. Uncle Sam isn't regulating or inspecting what you sell the public as closely now as he did a year before. And if you're a Christian academy, that's shorthand for segregated school, you're so much better off. Not only do you not have to pay taxes, but you don't have to have students whose skins are dark. A new kind of social Darwinism has been foisted upon us, the survival of the richest. But despite the oppressive forces which surround us, the heavy weight of the self-satisfied, the cold-heartedness of the neoconservative Confederacy, a great deal of the solution to our current problems lies within our own hands. There is a great deal we can do for ourselves. If the Reagan presidency and the conservative Congress force us to do on tomorrow that which we should have done on yesterday, then we may someday say with nostalgia that the early 1980s were the years in which black America awakened from a dangerous slumber. The power of the ballot box remains an undeveloped resource in most of black America. Only 61% of eligible blacks were registered to vote for president 2 years ago. Only 55% of them had the energy and initiative to actually cast their votes. Only 1/3 of those blacks between 18 and 25 are registered to vote. Nowhere in the country does black registration equal registration for whites. Nowhere in the country do black and white Americans vote equal percentages of their registered population. Almost nowhere in the country do black voters specify the demands we make on those who represent us. Almost nowhere in the country are we able to punish our enemies as easily as we reward our friends. Almost nowhere is Africa a part of our agenda. Our economic strength remains undervalued too. We abuse our purchase power. We dissipate our dollars through a merchant class that takes and seldom gives. We persist in the latter part of the 20th century in the outmoded belief that the other man's ice is colder, his sugar sweeter, and his medicine stronger. A people who believe that will never have ice, sugar, or medicine of their own. If we can but marshal our political and economic power, we can begin the process of making our rights more secure. And so the task before us is an immense one. The road forward is relatively clear. There is, I believe, a large number of Americans whose vision of the future does not match the view from the Oval Office. There is a sizable body of opinion in the United States which refuses to surrender yesterday's goals to the occupants of power and the princes of privilege. But these people, our country men and women, young and old, of all races, creeds, and colors, mistakenly believe themselves to be impotent, unable to influence the society in which they live. 20 years ago, black young people in the southeastern United States sat down in order to stand up for their rights. They marched and picketed and protested against state-sanctioned segregation and brought that system crashing to its knees. In later years, another generation said no to aggressive colonial war waged by their country in their name and put their bodies in the path of the war machine. Today's times require no less, and in fact, insist on more. There is a large space created by the lack of any effective political opposition to the selfishness that surrounds us. That space can be filled, the forceful opposition mobilized, but it will take hard work. New voters must be registered and organized and educated and energized. This year's congressional contest ought become 435 referenda on Reaganomics, surveys on the continuation of an aggressive foreign policy. Here will come a first national opportunity to purge the Congress of the moral majoritarians. Here is a first national test of the acceptability of the arrogance of power, a review and rejection of the radicalism of the rabid right, retention of the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, and a reversal of Republican control of the Senate cannot be ends of their own if their pursuit only means rewarding boll weevils and re-electing the faint-hearted. So while each of us may take some individual responsibility for reordering the nation's political priorities, there are other jobs that must be done as well. The scattered and fractured constituencies of progress, racial and language minorities, labor, the sexually oppressed, those for whom the American dream increasingly resembles a nightmare, must mobilize their troops and lead them once again into the streets against the barricades of apathy and indifference. Less than 20 years ago, a sitting president of the United States, secure in his power, was forced to abandon plans for re-election as an angry nation shouted no to his plans for war financed at the expense of America's poor. That shout ought be heard again in the United States, at every ballot box, at every forum where the people gather and the people meet. To accommodation with apartheid, we must say no. To the reversal of racial equality, we must say no. To the elimination of those programs which sustain life, we must say no. To the forward march of militarism, we must say no. To $1,000 China place settings, to ketchup on the school lunch menu, we must say no. We must say no to our self-imposed political impotence, to our seeming inability to help finance our own forward movement. You know, it is nothing short of a national scandal that while the majority of the people in this room owe so much of what they have today to the work of organizations like the NAACP, so few return the favor. You know, there are few of us so poor we could not afford a membership. There are few of us so busy we could not afford to give this organization and others like it some skill and some time. You know, the hooded knights of the Ku Klux Klan have experienced a 25% increase in membership in each of the last 2 years. Doesn't it make ordinary common sense that if the people dedicated to your death and destruction are growing in strength and power, that you ought to do the same? Ladies and gentlemen, I can announce tonight from this platform for the first time anywhere, do you believe that? That the reason why members of the KKK wear these tall, pointed, conical hats is to make up for physical imperfections in other parts of their bodies. About 3/4 of a century ago, the first black person to graduate from this university with a Doctor of Philosophy degree, the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, put forward a political prescription, an antidote to the kind of violence he saw about him then and we see about us now. He said then, "I believe in God who made of one blood all the races that dwell on the earth. I believe we all, black, brown, and white, are brothers, varying through time and opportunity, in form and gift and feature, but differing in no essential particular, alike in soul, and in the possibility of infinite development. I believe in service, humble, reverent service, from the blackening of boots to the whitening of souls. For work is heaven, idleness hell, and wages the well done of the master that summoned all them that labor and are heavy laden, making no distinction between the black sweating cotton hands of Georgia and the first families of Virginia, since all distinction not based on deed is devilish and not divine. I believe in the Prince of Peace. I believe that war is murder. I believe that armies and navies are at bottom the tinsel and braggadocio of oppression and wrong. And I believe that the wicked conquest of nations weak and darker by nations white and stronger but foreshadows the death of that strength. I believe in the training of children, black even as white, the leading out of little souls into green pastures and beside the still waters, not for pelf or peace, but for life lit by some large vision of beauty and goodness and truth, lest we forget, and the sons of the fathers like Esau for mere meat barter their birthright in a mighty nation. I believe in liberty for us all, the space to stretch our arms and our souls, the right to breathe, the right to vote, the freedom to choose our friends, to enjoy the sunshine, to ride on the railroad uncursed by color, thinking, hoping, dreaming, working as we will in a kingdom of God and love. Thank you.
Okay, early in your speech, you indicated that in the past, in the civil rights movement, blacks have presented a unified front to oppose segregation. And whether or not you agree with the assumptions and arguments presented by William Wilson and others, in relation to the declining significance of race and the increasing significance of class, how do you feel that the civil rights movement will account for the economic disparities that exist today among blacks that are even greater than those existed in the past?
The economic disparities that exist within blacks?
The black community, among
within the black community?
Yes.
As opposed to the black and white communities? Within
the black community, and that account for different political outlooks from the middle-class blacks as opposed to those of lower income classes.
Well, I'm not sure I altogether agree with the thesis that the significance of race has declined as much as Professor Wilson apparently believes it does. In fact, I doubt if it's declined. Anyway, so I think there is at least latent race consciousness among the totality of the black community. It is among certain young black people of high school or college age where you find this consciousness missing. And it is among certain members of a certain income class, high income class in black America, where you find this consciousness denied. But I believe it exists throughout the totality of black America, and I think the proper strategy for the remainder of the 80s is to awaken this consciousness, to couple it with class consciousness where that consciousness is called upon, because most of us belong to a single class. You know, the divisions between us are minute enough so that it is a minority of us who can afford the luxury of talking about us and them. So I think the correct strategy for the future is to essentially employ many of the techniques that have been used in the past. I think they're still effective. Political action, the act of petition, whether in the form of 100,000 people strong or 100 signing a letter to John Smith or Joe Blow. I think the tactics themselves do not radically change. It is the articulation of the goals which has to change, and I think that must essentially be based on race consciousness and on awakening the racial consciousness of the black mass. I think it's merely dormant now and has not disappeared. It's the Reagan administration has embarked on a racial attack on black America, and have just come forward on yesterday with the preposterous notion that the Voting Rights Act ought to be weakened because black voters vote Democratic, and therefore we should be denied the equal right to vote. This is the Attorney General of the United States. You know, this is not some backwoods joker from my home state. This is a sophisticated cosmopolitan attorney speaking. So I think what we must do is reawaken the latent racial consciousness in black America and somehow mobilize it into political and other kinds of action.
A two-part question, just out of curiosity. I know that the Reagan administration supports a lot of bad governments, but which one did you mean when you said they're supporting the worst government on earth? And secondly, comparing the Reagan administration to the Carter administration in the field of civil rights, I know that, of course, it's much worse, but are you satisfied with what the Carter administration did, or do you think that they should have been stronger also in the field of civil rights?
No, I think the Carter administration could have done more, but the comparison is what I'm interested in, and the Reagan administration is so obviously worse than its predecessors that the Carter administration looked like a band of angels, which many of them thought they were. The government I had reference to is the government of the Republic of South Africa, which I consider to be the worst on the face of the earth.
Would you comment on the movement on the part of the plaintiffs in the Boston school desegregation case to move for a so-called freedom of choice plan, and the theory that underlies that, and some people's part, that the Brown decision, in fact, did not call for integrated education, but rather the end to deliberate segregation education?
Well, I don't know anything about the particulars of this case here, but from your description of it, I'd always thought that the Brown decision called for the dismantling of the dual system of public education in the United States, and if a logical legal result of that can be a system of free choice for pupils determined how? By those who live in the geographic confines of the city of Boston, or those who live in sections of the city of Boston, I should want to know more about who can participate in this free choice and how free the choice is before assuming that this was a good or a bad idea. What does it mean?
Well, the original plaintiffs have asked for the freedom of choice plan. Thomas Atkins from the NAACP has come back into the case to argue against that and to retain Garrity's orders. So there's some division. And, well, those who argue against the freedom of choice plan contend that it will simply sanction the dual system once again. And,
Well, there you go. I don't know. I don't know that much about it. Tom Atkins is against it. I don't know.
Do you think that the black community should pursue product boycott strategies? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Yes, of course we should, because they work. That's why we should do it. Here, Jesse Jackson threatened to boycott the Coca-Cola company, and they said, "Oh, don't do that, please. We'll give you this." And they signed this covenant. And they signed this covenant, which puts this company much further forward in a helpful role toward black America than it had been before. Now, this is not to say Coca-Cola does all it should, but it does a whole lot more now than it did 6 months ago. And peculiarly, the company, you know, the headquarters in Atlanta, they explained this decision in this way, that they were about to announce their new affirmative action plans, and all of a sudden, their I think it ought to be done on a national basis, and it ought to be done as it has been done time and time again in the past on a local basis. Reverend Leon Sullivan was a pioneer of this kind of notion 20 years ago in Philadelphia when he organized a group he called the 400 Ministers and picked first bread companies in Philly and picked them one at a time. The first one he picked was the delicious Tasty Cake Company, which bakes these delicious, tasty cakes. If people live in the Philadelphia area, you know they're good, so it's hard to get people to stop eating them. And they stopped eating them, and the Tasty Cake Company hired black truck drivers and put these tasty cakes in this place and put some... Anyway, they did many things they would not have normally have done. So sure, I don't think there are too many methods we should not employ. And I'm always confused by people who say, well, if we're voting all the time, should we do this? But, you know, I think we have to do all these things. It's a luxury to do one. It's a luxury to think that there's a good way and a bad way, or a best way and a better way. I think there are many, many ways to push us forward, and all of them, as many as possible of them, have to be employed.
Thank you.
What effect do you project that the growing Hispanic population is going to have on race relations in the country, both in terms of the black population and the white population?
I don't know. I think it depends on that population, first of all, and its ability to relate either cross-cultural lines to the population most nearly like it, or upward across cultural lines to the population that parts of it may hope to be like. In some parts of the country I've been in where the Hispanic population is highly organized and politicized, there's an enormous difficulty in getting the adjacent black community to do the same and to realize that here is an effective group of people with whom we share a great deal in common and with whom we ought to be cooperating and working. And it's disheartening for me, at any rate, to see these two communities at odds and to realize, at least in one or two occasions, that it is the black community which is fostering the division between them through its own inability to organize itself and pull itself together. But I think they ought to be cooperating. I don't know the Hispanic community or what it is likely to do, or if it has a group mind. But I should think these two groups of people ought to be cooperating together. They will be a majority of the state of California quite shortly, if they're not already, and a growing percentage of the population in Texas, although those people leaving Detroit are tipping that balance. But they ought to be cooperating together more than they do.
Yes. First of all, I'm happy to see you here, Senator Bond, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, but I hear in your voice it seems like a renewed sense of purpose and a renewed vigor. And I want to ask you. Since our communities on all levels lack or is experiencing pervasive social care,
Well, but not had, and I'm not sure if I ever had one that was particularly different from that than anybody else had, and I cannot unfortunately report too many hopeful signs that I may have seen in the last months or weeks or days of some rather intensive traveling around the United States. But I do get about a whole lot. I was in Minnesota yesterday, and Kansas the day before that, North Carolina the day before that, and Oklahoma the day before that, and Arizona the day before that. And see a lot of people in the country, and a great deal of what I see is depressing. I see an enormous amount of young black college students who haven't got the slightest idea who they are, where they came from, or how they got to be where they are. And that's real depressing. And this ranges from sort of prestige sorts of schools like Davidson College to Oklahoma State, you know, from big public to small private schools, junior colleges, to all income strata and level. It's depressing, I tell you, see these people. But then on the other hand, you go to Milwaukee, and here 10,000 people marching in the streets to protest the police murder of a black man. And you begin to say, hey, these people, this is in freezing cold. You know, these people don't wait for the summertime, but they have a point to make, and they want to make it now. So you have to feel some encouragement. And then you look over in over the past summer, march of 15,000 people in Mobile to support the Voting Rights Act, another of 7,000 people in Birmingham. A march began a week ago Monday from Tuskegee, Alabama to Washington, D.C., here, there, this, that, the other thing, little groups of people putting themselves together, primarily adults, older people, real people, people who are out there in the workaday world, as opposed to the people that one normally associates with this kind of political work. So I see some signs of hopefulness. I just tend to be an optimistic person, I guess. I don't believe people were meant to live the way many of us live, and I don't believe the people who live that way are going to tolerate it much longer. They haven't tolerated it in the past, they won't tolerate it in the future, and they will insist that something be done about it. So I'm essentially just an optimistic person. I've seen in my lifetime things go from very bad to a little better. And saw it happen just through the work of a relatively minute portion of the population. You know, it's romantic to look back from 1982 to 1960 and to imagine that every black person in America was sitting in at a lunch counter. And to hear some people tell it, they were, you know. But reasonably, you have to know that you're talking about a minute fraction of the black community and an even more minute fraction of the white community that was engaged in these kind of protests and eliminated legal apartheid in the United States in 5 years. 5 years and it was gone. Tremendous accomplishment. If that could be done, then I see no reason why similar sorts of movements and drives can't eliminate some of the different kinds of racial-based problems that we have today. So I'm essentially an optimist.
I would like to say that your insistence that we should do things for ourselves is not said enough. And to consistently rap the Reagan administration or any administration for doing something that we should do for ourselves, I think is missing the point. There have been some discussion on a national black bank that should be established and well-formed such that if there are people who need money, there is a system whereby we can fuel and fund ourselves directly and not have to wait for welfare and not have to wait for public assistance, however that is defined. And I think that if more people, if it's ingrained in us that we have to do for ourselves, irrespective of what the administration does, I think that kind of attitude will foster a certain sense of self and direction. And I applaud that you do not take the stance that because they aren't doing something, we should get them to do something, but the protest would be more for us in the end. So I'm not eliciting a response, I'm more or less.
I won't give one.
Do you find the Reagan administration's plan to switch ADFC and food stamp programs for Medicaid with the states, funded by a $28 million four-year trust fund, feasible?
No, it's not feasible. I've served in a state legislature. I've been in the state legislature in Georgia since 1967. I know the people who are there. I see them 40 days a year, day in and day out. I know that a woman with 3 dependent children in Georgia can expect to take home about $129 a month. And this at a time, some years back, when the state was relatively affluent and had money to spare. And we were paying a welfare family of four $128 a month. And no way in the world, I think, given less money from the federal government and having to face the possibility of increasing taxes on our population, state taxes on our population, are we going to increase that sum to a livable level or in any way find monies from any other source that would make it a palatable level for human beings to live and exist on? It is, theoretically, it's a dream idea. Here's local government, somebody like me having all this power, great idea. But in actual practice, I think it would be a real disaster. It would be a disaster for the people involved, it would be a disaster for sections of the country, and it would be a disaster, period.
Senator Bond, I wanted to press you a little further. I, too, am very concerned about the apparent apathy on college campuses across the nation. During the 60s, indeed, much of the intellectual rhetoric and justification and the underlying moral values of the civil rights struggle
Well, I think there's several reasons why this condition exists, and some of them are make it a bit more understandable, not one that you want to encourage, but make it a bit more understandable. First, I used to believe that the decade of the 1960s when I was in college, I thought that was the rule, that that's what college students always had done. In point of fact, that was the exception. You know, the generation before us didn't do much of that, and the generations that came after didn't do much of that. We were the exception, not the rule. So it's unfair to expect this group of people to do what we did just because we did it. They ought to be doing it for reasons of their own, but not in comparison with what we did then. Secondly, I think they suffer from not having any immediate history of their own, that people their age can do anything. I am, again, meet lots and lots of college students very quickly and usually very superficially, but they always tell me, well, nothing I can do. You know, no one listens to me. Who cares what I think, and so on. And I say, why don't you do this? And they say, no, that won't work. And I say, well, why don't you do this? They say, no, that won't work either. You know, there's this enormous negative attitude that I find frightening in people that age, 18, 19-year-old, for people to be so negative about their own abilities to move mountains, to accomplish things done, get things done. I'll tell you a little quick story, which I like to tell, because it shows how what one person can do. This is the kind of story used to be told in Bible class. I imagine many people here know who Herschel Walker is. Herschel Walker plays football for the University of Georgia. He is one of about 40% of the Georgia football team is black. That's why they're so good. But none of the coaches at Georgia are black. There are only 2 schools in the conference that don't have any black coaches, and Georgia's one of them. Well, I had an intern working in my office in the state capitol this year, a young boy named Marvin Nunnally, who goes to Georgia, and he wrote a letter to Coach Dooley. He said, Dear Coach Dooley, I hope you will, he had a vacancy on his staff. He said, I hope you will consider hiring a qualified black person to fill this vacancy, a line coach or something like that. Well, Coach Dooley wrote back and said, I'm not going to hire any unqualified person. Like the guy said, hire an unqualified person, you know. He said, I'm not going to hire any unqualified person. I want somebody who's good, not just black. Because you couldn't be both, you see. So then Marvin, this little fellow Marvin wrote a letter out and took it to me and had me sign it. So I wrote Coach Dooley a letter. Well, I'm a state senator. I vote in his appropriations, you know. Then he wrote another letter out and took it across the street to the city hall and got Andy Young to sign it. So then Andy Young wrote him a similar kind of letter, said, Dear Coach Dooley, I hope you will hire a qualified black coach. And Dooley for a minute got his back up, you know. He said, don't pressure me. I can't pressure me. I'm the coach. But he said, I'll tell you what he said. He said, I offered a job to Horace King. Anybody know who Horace King is? Horace King plays for the Detroit Lions. He's a Georgia alumnus. Now, would you give up a job with the Detroit Lions to go down and coach in Athens, Georgia? Of course he didn't. Dooley said, I want the job to go to an alumnus. But anyway, finally, to make a long story short, he has hired a black coach, and the guy is there coaching now, and he will be there coaching as long as he wants to coach at Georgia. This one guy did this. Now, I go over to Morehouse, which is my alma mater, and talk to these guys, say, hey, nothing we can do, the man got it, you know. What is this? What is this? I never run across this in 15 years or so, this negative attitude. And I think it's that these young people haven't got any immediate history of anybody their age doing anything at all. It was stimulating to me when I was 18 and 19 years old to look on the television at a girl named Elizabeth Eckford, who integrated the public schools in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I can remember her mother saying, when Elizabeth came home at night, her dress was so wet with spit I could wring it out. And
I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. And the Kennedy School, bills itself as it's going to give us the future leaders of America. It's also a school which I don't even know if it has any black professors, any minority. Doesn't have any women. It's only token women professors, only a few Hispanic professors, if any. In addition, I had the pleasure of going down to Cuba over Christmas, and they said, "You're in a school of politics. How many Marxists are there?" And I said, "None." And it was it's a place which is probably going to be giving us a lot of our future leaders of America, but we're not getting a lot of input. That's why I appreciate your being here tonight. With that preface in mind, I guess it's a decision I have to make myself, whether how much energy I want to put into this place to try to change it, and whether I should try to use my energy in some other avenue. With your trying to use that as an analogy, you seem like you've worked within the Democratic Party for a long period of time. Do you think it's worthwhile for you to continue putting your energy in the Democratic Party, or do you think it's worthwhile to go towards a Citizens Party or some other progressive orientation, front of coalition of progressive groups?
Well, I will say I used to be much more active as a Democrat with a big D than I am now. I used to be on my state executive committee, and I used to be on my county executive committee, and I used to participate in the activities of the party a great deal, but haven't done much in the last several years. Both because I thought that my efforts were more likely spent elsewhere, and because that kind of party politics doesn't interest me as much now as it once did. I don't really know how to answer your question, except it depends on case by case. I have been involved in a lot of different political parties in my lifetime, both as a member, as a supporter, and in many different ways, but I just don't have much to do. I run as a Democrat. I get elected as a Democrat. I'm going to win the Democratic primary in August, and I'm going to be back in the legislature in next January, but I'm just not involved in party activities at all. It's not something that crosses my mind much. But if that situation you described prevails here at the school, I wonder what do the students do about it. Many of them probably say, well, I would do something about it, but I got to get out first. Because if I say something about it now, they may not let me out. Or they may let me out too quick.
You suggested that we get together on a grassroots level and begin to organize, encourage voter registration, and start a movement that way. Does the black leadership in this country have an agenda? Is the black leadership together?
The black leadership is more together now than I've ever seen it. You know, this is incredible. I keep hearing these people say, what's the black leaders doing? What are the black followers doing? If anything, I think we have more leaders than we need. We have an excess of leaders. But the so-called leaders of the national organizations looked at this month's Ebony. They've got their annual list of the 100 most influential black people in the country. And I'm sure you could say, well, this person doesn't belong there or this person should be there. But among these 100 men and women are the heads of the NAACP, which is the largest organization of black people interested in civil rights in this country, the head of PUSH, the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Mr. Jacobs, who was here recently, a couple of other people who head national civil rights organizations. These people meet together once a month. They plan projects in common. They exchange ideas. They are not at each other's throats. They are not running in opposite directions. And while you may disagree with the common approach they have taken, you cannot charge them with not coordinating their activities with each other, because they do it. They have a series of notions. Each of them has an individual agenda, and they have common group agendas, and their agendas are generally this: the empowerment of black America, both through the political process, through the greater economic self-sufficiency. That is a common agenda of all these groups, and I don't think it's one that most people would disagree with. But you wanted to say more, I think.
Well, no, I just did want to turn that back to you. I appreciate the idea of grassroots organization, and I believe we can do more of that. But I would like to see
one, to register more voters, number one. Number two, to develop the black community economically, to support black businesses, to support ourselves. That's number two. And number three, to get more memberships in the NAACP. That's the 3 points in the NAACP's 1982 agenda. Now, a lot of people say, well, hey, I'm not giving no money to those Uncle Toms. But, you know, that's a large group of people out there working every day all over this country doing one thing or another, some of it wrong and some of it right. The point I want to make is that all these groups, I think, have a fairly simple, direct agenda. I doubt if Operation Push's agenda is very different from that, the empowerment of black America. I doubt if the Urban League's agenda is very different from that, or any of these other groups' agenda. Best legal minds in civil rights in the country. There are lawyers practicing this field all over the country. I'm suing the state of Georgia right now, and I have 2 white lawyers. They are the 2 best lawyers in their field in the United States. I'm convinced of it, and we're going to win our case. In the early 1960s, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the National Urban League had regular meetings among their top leadership, divided responsibility geographically as well as programmatically among themselves, and that's not very, very different from what these same people are doing now. I think the notion that the leadership is in disarray and is going off in opposite directions and can't get together is a big mistake. I don't think that's the case. I think the fellowship is in disarray and going off in different directions, and I think there's a longing for some central figure to say, come and follow me. I don't believe that's going to happen, but I think there is a longing in a great deal of black America and a great deal of white America who want to know which one of it, who speaks for you all, which one of them is it? But I think we are fairly well led. We just, yeah, right. We don't, I don't know what it is, but I don't think the fault can be laid at the feet of the leadership figures.
No, I wasn't intending to lay any fault.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.